So I'm recording
Okay, so now it's
now.
recording.
You see it?
I do see it.
All right. So tell me, Michael, about your philosophy about population control versus resource consumption reduction.
Well, I'd like to preface this by saying that the reason I'm generally skeptical of population control measures is
Okay.
because historically, when they've been done very, very badly to a degree that creates more harm than it even seems like it was trying to do in the first place, right?
Okay.
And in addition to that, as environmental measures, they don't seem to have worked. They don't seem to have worked. They basically have, unless you eliminate the country, they have not worked basically as environmental measures, right? For example, one of the most famous kind of like population decreases through kind of like quasi-planned measures was in China under Mao, right? And they did that through changing the supply of food, basically. Some people say it was because of problems of imperialism. The other countries weren't trading with China, and because of that, they weren't able to produce enough food. But there's been historical evidence to show that it was at least quasi-planned, or at the very least, if it initially was because of imperialistic problems, that eventually they turned it into a plan of reducing the population, right? And in that case, it didn't really do much environmentally if you want to just talk about the way that the agriculture was going. Obviously, it didn't really have that much impact when it comes to atmospheric problems or oceanic problems, because at that time that wasn't really the forefront concern. People weren't really monitoring that. But just to say, that's my first concern about this, right? Population control measures seem to be, even when they're well-intentioned, end in horrible amounts of harm, and often when they're not well-intentioned, they're straight up like fascist, right? But away from the point of trying to say why population control is bad, right? Positively, it seems like we're not using the resources of the earth in a way that makes sense, frankly, right? Like I said earlier, the US wastes most of its food that it buys, right? If it didn't waste most of its food that it buys, it would reduce the amount of food consumption it has by, I think, something in the region of like half, right? Alone, that's not going to avert disaster, right? We're only one country. That's only one aspect of production, right? But when you start looking at how production works, and you start changing the way production works so that it's more in line with a sensible way of organizing production, then I think what you can figure out is that you don't need to focus on trying to reduce the amount of people. The amount of people in the world can be accommodated without depleting the earth, right? In addition to that, I also want to say that—
Will you say that again?
It seems like, according to a lot of resources, that the amount of resources that are on the earth can provide for the amount of people that are on the earth right now, and can provide for the amount of people that are going to be on the earth within the next 50 to 100 years at the very least. It's hard to predict outside of that because you don't get the kind of granularity after like 100 years in those models, right? So when I think about population measures, right, to ignore the fact that production is organized in a way that doesn't make sense as a way of distributing resources, right? The reason production doesn't happen the way it should is because production is centered around making money. And frankly, making money is centered around making an increasing amount of stuff, even if it doesn't actually get consumed, right? So what I was trying to say there is that we can drastically reduce the amount of resources that we're consuming, and it still will provide for the amount of people in the world, right? Also wanted to note, though, that I do think meat is wrong. I don't think that there should be meat production. That's going to be part of changing the way we produce. I don't necessarily disagree with antinatalism either. It's just that antinatalism shouldn't be like a way to like reduce the population. It should be a way of looking at, well, if you're going to bring a person into the world, is this person going to live a good life or not, right? Are other people around them going to live a good life or not? It shouldn't be seen as a political act to make sure to suppress a population. That's, to me, that seems almost quasi-fascistic, right? And in fact, there's been a lot of criticisms of certain kinds of antinatalists for basically trying to imply that the way population control should work is, you know, it ends up affecting poor people, it ends up affecting people of color, it ends up affecting those kind of people the worst, right? Not, they don't say that directly straight out, and usually they don't even mean to have that, but when you look at their principles, sometimes it comes out as that's the policy, you know, prescription, right? So that's what I was really trying to say in there, right? What Mitch was trying to say about production being like efficient and stuff like that is extremely wrong, I think. We don't operate in an efficient way. We operate in a way that is organized for profit. Organized for profit is not a way of organizing such that it makes sense as a distribution of goods to actually provide for people. So that's kind of the point, the position that I had with regard to what was happening in that previous group.
I'm trying to understand. Are you saying that efficiency does not equal production, or you're saying it's not as efficient as he thinks?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely do think that.
There's a lot of waste, just like we waste a lot of food.
Yeah, but waste comes in a lot of different forms, yes. Right? Waste comes in the form of pollution. It comes in the form of unconsumed goods. It comes in the form of other non-pollution but environmentally degrading, you know, problems like various kinds of disease spread. This happens in labor a lot. Think about it like this. When you organize production in a way that forces people to work ungodly hours in bad conditions, that population is going to get more sick, and that population, as getting more sick, is going to, you know, make the earth worse in various ways by consuming different kinds of resources that are in other ways organized to not be used in the right way. Think about the healthcare system, right? People don't know that an amazing amount of stuff in the healthcare industry is also just straight up not used. It's just sold off. For example, right now, everybody knows that 3M is making the most masks right now, but there's the estimate, I think there's been a couple estimates, and I don't really know which one to trust, frankly, but the consensus, or at least, I don't know, I don't want to call it a consensus. The evidence seems to point to the fact that the amount of masks that are being produced doesn't even equal the amount that are being consumed. It seems like more are being produced than are being consumed, and that there's a whole supply of just masks alone that are going into like the air. Like they're just getting destroyed somehow. Like nobody knows where they are. It's probably people stockpiling them that are waiting to sell them at a price that's suitable to them, right? In that case, what you do in that case is you've produced this much amount more than you needed, right? You just do less. Yeah, right? So in that case, you might be efficient with regard to the amount of profit that you make, but with regard to as a distribution of resources to provide for needs, it's not like efficient at all.
That's what I was grasping for. Efficiency does not equal profit. Yeah.
Yeah, we can think about efficiency as a way of addressing needs in a country rather than as a way of organizing or as producing profit.
Mm-hmm. So I'm getting that you're saying if there's profit, there can be gross inefficiency and still be profit.
Oh, definitely. Yep, look at the way most startups work. The way most startups work is literally just through an accumulation of mass amounts of debt. And the debt is actually part of what indicates their value. Everybody, like WeWork, have you heard of WeWork before? WeWork is this like startup that the whole point of it is like they make these like rental spaces for people to work in. So like right? They had no properties. They had zero properties. They had zero things lined up. They had massive amounts of debts, and they were valued extremely high. And then when everybody found out that they had no actual resources, and they had also a massive amount of debt, which made no sense to them because their capital was stored in a way that it was transitory between, like, it's not money, but it wasn't also stocks. It was in various other kinds of options, and they were going to use that to get the various kinds of properties, right, for their actual the service that they were going to provide, right? So even just in non-production method, right, just in the way of like various kinds of like social organization of like non-physical goods happen, right? The way it happens is not organized to make sense as a distribution to accord with needs of a population. It's organized in a way to maximize a profit, which usually means in some way overproducing or producing in such a way that creates negative externalities, even if it does maximize your amount of profit. Another example, sorry, I just came up with another example.
Go ahead.
You'd probably be familiar with this because you're more familiar with the animal rights stuff, but I think have you heard of the fact that a bunch of like dairy farmers were literally commanded by the dairy, whatever the dairy, like National Dairy Association or whatever, to just straight up like waste a whole like 30% of their milk because they couldn't sell it at the price that they wanted to. Like that's exactly the kind of thing you're just wasting it at that point. It's not organized in a way to accord with needs. It's just organized in a way to accord with profit.
Good. That was 12 minutes. Perfect. So yeah, that went off. I wanted to talk mostly about the population control. That really ticked me off. That's where I got triggered because I felt like you were going into the lollipops and pink balloons area. Have children because things are going to be okay for our children. So I'm going to pick a bone with you about how you're saying, we don't know exactly how, it's hard to predict, but we're good for at least 50 to 100 years. Well, that's not good enough, is it? I mean, how bad do things have to get, So if you think that the amount of resources that we're consuming are enough we're able to keep pace with that it's sustainable for 50 to 100 years at least, but it's hard to predict, that doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement to me. But I do agree that going back to the beginning, because this is sort of like heading towards the middle, going back to the beginning, your population control measures, doing more harm than good, didn't work and really didn't have any good impact on the environment, even though that was, like you said, kind of on the back burner at the time. It was less of a priority, even if it was well-intentioned, and in many cases it wasn't. This is all a reality-based, time-tested kind of outlook that you have. We have seen this happen before, but I think it's kind of can be looked at from a different perspective, as in rather than whatever happened in the past is more likely to happen in the future, look at it more like, yeah, history may repeat itself unless we learn from it. So I would think that I'm questioning myself whether there needs to be a political movement about antinatalism and how to go about, infecting people's brain with it, whether politicizing it is going to be helpful or not. But I think that once I started listening to you, I realized that dialogue is going to be really important to have with people, and maybe the political arena is the only place to have that dialogue, because those are important questions. How are we not going to do more harm than good? What works and what doesn't work? What kind of an environmental impact can population reduction have? So rather than looking at it as this has happened in the past and not been a good outlook, it's been, tyrannical or totalitarian or fascistic or whatever. Maybe if it is well-intentioned, maybe if it is looking at the past and what went wrong and how it can be done ethically, what would you say to that is my question, So And then you went on to the waste issue of food. I don't understand your concept of wasting more food than we buy. So maybe you could go into that a little bit for me. But I think what you're saying is very specific there. And I don't know if you mean to be as specific as you are, if that's an actual statistic that you have. So you mean more than, we waste more than we buy. How can we waste more? You mean the industry wastes more than the consumers buy, not the consumers wasting more than they buy, because the consumer can't waste more than they buy. But as an industry, are you saying the industry buys or produces more than the consumers are willing to buy, so there's always waste? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's usually what the case is. The various industries will produce X amount, right? But it turns out that you can provide for the needs of a population with X minus however much amount of what you produced. And then there's a whole amount of it that was created usually to extract profits in some way. Mm-hmm. And then some of it, that whole amount just doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't provide for any needs. It doesn't get recycled. It doesn't get repurposed in any way. It just goes into the ether, basically, right? So, for example, if you go to the back, if you literally go to the like dumpster of any given like fast food restaurant on any given night, if you look in their dumpster, there's going to be bags and bags of just unused food that they just threw away at the end of the night, right? In that case, the various kinds of food production industries are producing an amount, right? And then it's more than the actual population of people needs. And then it just goes into the ether and there is no reason to do it, right? Overproduction is a thing. I never denied that overproduction is a thing, right? Yeah. What I was saying was that we can reduce the amount we produce and still provide for the amount of people that are on the earth.
How likely is that? I mean,
likely in terms of a political way of doing things. How are we going to be able to convince various kinds of industries to change the way they produce such that they won't be?
What I'm saying is that I could subject the same doubt to your reduction of consumption that you have applied to the population control, that there's some doubt that I have about the efficacy of that and how you are able to calculate that it could offset the continued growth of the population at the rate that it is.
Well, it's unclear. Well, the other thing about population growth is that when you look at most models of population growth, the person I'm going the most off of here is Angus Deaton, right? He does a lot of work when it comes to the way economies work outside of the quote unquote first world, right? Because when people think about population growth, they're not talking about America. They're not talking about Canada. They're not talking about Germany, right? They're talking about this quote unquote second and third world, right? Yes. For some reason that's not acknowledged. I don't know why, right? People want to say that we need to reduce population in second and third world countries.
You don't know why that is?
Well, I know why that is, but the thing is,
when I talk about we, I'm not, we might have a big misunderstanding here, because when I talk about we, I'm talking about the globe.
Yeah, but most countries like the United States, Canada, Germany, Sweden, maybe Japan, I'm not exactly sure about Japan, the population's not like going to be growing within the next like 50 years.
But what about the countries that are growing at 20% or at, I don't know if it's 20% or if the marker is 20. I have to.
Yeah, there definitely are countries that are still growing in population.
I think countries it's called the rate of rise or something, which is the actual net number that gives you how much the population is increasing. But there's a specific term for that statistic.
Yeah, so you can talk about how much the population increased from year to year, but you can also talk about the way that the increase is changing over time, right? It's just like a second order derivative, right? So
I think because it's been so high in the countries that have less education for women, the argument has been for reproductive services to be made free, and that's a very antinatalist program. So
That
I think
sounds good
there's
to
a
me too.
tendency, yeah, I think there's a tendency to radicalize antinatalism as something that's really zany and far out there. But having women be educated in how their bodies work and how fertility works and how you know, they can educate themselves better to not just be a baby maker, and they can actually take some control over their reproduction by birth control or abortion, then that's a key piece. That's all antinatalist. That's preventing birth. So
I like
that's a
that.
good.
I like that, but that to me doesn't seem to be population control. That seems to be a way of empowering people to be able to make decisions by themselves.
Oh, it's definitely population control.
I mean, I guess it's population control in that the result will usually be that people will start having less children, right?
Yes. And that is
But
the intention going into it.
yeah, that seems okay to me because it's a voluntary asking. It's giving people a certain kind of resources and letting them make their decisions about their own lives themselves, right?
So that's where I think you might be misunderstanding where I don't know what circles you've been in with antinatalism, but I would say the lack of a parity with the effects of antinatalism regarding race and people of color, like you were saying, or, you know, I think that the reason it looks that way, it's not that way, but the reason it looks that way is because those are the communities that tend to receive the free services, the free birth control, the free abortion. So that might look to some people even eugenicist. I've even had people say it's eugenicist, which it's definitely not. It's providing a need to the community that's there, of giving women control over their reproductive, you know, choices. So it's not, there might be a lack of parity in that sense, that those services are used more by people who are uneducated and poor, and you see that play out in the second and third world countries. So it might look like a lack of parity in the effects of antinatalism when it really is actually just a disproportionate amount of birth in certain demographics that is addressed by antinatalist policies and results in a lot of consequence to those communities.
Yeah. And if you think about the way that we did, for example, Planned Parenthood in the United States contemporarily, not like 50 years ago or 100 years ago, because the way that it was done 100 years ago, I think is literally wrongful eugenics in certain ways. They paid people to get sterilized knowing that people were economically disadvantaged. That's not good, right? But if we're talking about the way that we do, for example, Planned Parenthood in America right now, right, that seems to be totally permissible to me, and maybe even in some I wouldn't aim for it as the population control. It seems to be good as just a way to increase people's freedom, right? That's just a better way to do life in general, right? If it has the consequences of lowering the population, and lowering the population reduces consumption, which, by the way, I don't think it would. I don't think that producers are very are robustly responsive to changes in the population or anything like that either. Think about it like this: if the economy is premised on growth and the population reduces, producers are just going to find a way to keep producing more, despite the fact that the population goes down, right? So what you said is good, right? But also things to keep in mind here is there have been various times in history where efforts to do things that sounded good were done in ways that ended up being pretty bad. For example, you probably know about the fact that early on in Planned Parenthood's history in America, they literally paid people, especially Black people in urban communities that were poor, mostly because they were poor, to get sterilized, knowing that they were desperate for the amount of money, hoping that they can control the Black population to maintain a kind of white supremacy in the United States, right? On the face
I
of
don't
it,
know if I believe that, actually. I think that it was more of like serving the needs of the community. I don't know that I believe that narrative.
There's been documentations of that happening. In fact, there are still people who do it on a non-institutionalized basis today. If you look up on YouTube, there's literally a woman who goes around in her RV paying Black people in like poor communities to get sterilized with her own personal money, right? You're not going to catch that done on an institutionalized level. And even when Planned Parenthood was starting in America at the beginning, they didn't do it on a large scale. It was more like little. It was a localized decision to do those kinds of things based on the leadership and the funding of individual outlets, right? So but there is documentation of that kind of thing happening, right? And I don't think an antinatalist should be comfortable with a situation in which we're paying poor people to get sterilized when they're desperate for money, right? But I'm not saying that that's mostly what's happening. I don't think that is mostly what happened. It just happened on a smaller scale, right?
I think there are worse things that can happen. I mean, given that time period, if that did happen, there were probably a lot of worse things that were going on at that time. And it was just a brutal time. Like, when was that, in the 50s?
Yeah, mostly the 40s and the 50s.
So that was when, it was on the regular that there were race wars and race riots and Black people getting thrown around by the police. Just
definitely.
Nothing. And
those things are bad too. Yeah, definitely.
So the whole environment was just really bad. And I can see how Planned Parenthood leaders might have been like, what can we do to address this? What I wanted to say, though, about your Planned Parenthood perspective is interesting because you have a very cynical or negative view of it in the early days, and then a more like what I would call a sugar-coated view of it now, because you're like, well, we can present it as community-based and empowering people, but we don't want to present it as anti-natalist. It's like, you can't get away from the kernel of truth. Mando, it's an anti-natalist program. It is recognizing that some life is not worth bringing into the world.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
It will endure.
I'm okay with that.
Suffering can be economic. That suffering can be based on race. There are arguments to be made that, maybe Black people should have suicided and just gone the way of the dodo, That's pretty out there, but it's not.
I mean, there are some Black Afro pessimists who may say something like that. I'm not aware of what they say, but there is a movement called like Afro pessimism and Black pessimists. Maybe they thought that. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, there have been a lot of. There's my view borders on pro-mortalism. It really does. And I don't see death as a negative thing. I don't see extinction as necessarily a terrible thing when it comes to the human race. So I really think that the longer the humans have been on the planet, the more suffering has been created, and the more and the more and the more. And it's just cumulative. And you can't get away from that. So it really is worse now than it used to be in some ways because it's cumulative.
Yeah, that may definitely be true, right?
And more people are suffering now than ever before.
That might be the case, right? But when I hear, I forgot what her name was. I think her name was Christine, saying, "I disagreed with part of the China one child policy, but ultimately it was the right thing to do." Like, that should ring a bell at people's head. Like that was wrong. That policy is wrong. The way it happened is wrong. It literally forced people. Think about it like this. If you're for abortion rights because you want people to have autonomy, and then on the flip side of it, you say, "Oh, but you can only have one child. So past that, we're going to penalize you, and we're gonna control how you use your body past this point," right? What's really the justification there, right? If you want to reduce the population, right? If you think that's a way to go, you have to do it in a way that's voluntary, completely voluntary, right? It does not seem like there is an air of voluntariness, of radical voluntariness, right? When it comes to certain kinds of policies that are aimed at reducing the population. I can agree with the point that there are lives that are going to be worse off than if they never existed at all, right? But you can't say, because that's the case, I'm going to force this individual to use their bodies in certain ways. That's wrong.
I would go with the number 2 on your list, that it didn't work, you know? I mean, it's ended up having this consequence of all these women, or no, all these men and no women, right? Because they had to keep the boy and abort the girl. So that's one angle of the problem right there, is that there's this huge problem for a whole generation of people, that there's way more men than women. That can't be a good thing, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's probably not good.
Work in that sense. It didn't work.
Yeah, it created there was a consequence of the policy that made a state of affairs that created a source of harm that wasn't anticipated, and now adds into the calculation, pushing it towards it being overall harmful.
I don't know if they didn't see the consequences. I don't know.
I mean, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Maybe they just didn't care, right?
Yeah.
I mean, whatever. I don't want to try to figure out whatever the intentions of politicians have. That's, to me, I just don't care, right?
Yeah.
You have to just be clear about what are the goals of a certain kind of policy. And if you know what the consequences are going to be, and then you just ignore certain kinds of consequences, it starts to be clear that the goal of the policy wasn't like environmental in the first place. By the way, I don't know if it really was about, I'm pretty sure that like China's one-child policy was not mostly about the environment. I thought it was mostly about the population just outstripping production at the time, because if you look at the amount of waste that happens in China, it is a radically different amount than in the United States, right? They don't waste food. They don't waste materials. They don't, do that kind of thing. They actually take waste from other countries and then turn it into other things, right? So
they do. Don't they buy our garbage?
Yeah, they do. They buy our garbage, although they're starting to stop doing that because they don't know how to change it into other useful things anymore. So I don't know. There's weird things going on the front of buying recycling and buying garbage from other countries in the Southeast Asian and the just general kind of like Northern Asia. I guess it's not really Northern Asia. I mean China and Japan basically. But it used to be that China and some other Southeast Asian countries bought the world's garbage and then turned it into useful things because they literally were looking for more ways to produce, because the needs of their population were getting close to the amount that they could produce, right? So
well, there you go. I mean, doesn't that tell you something? They're not wasting, and yet they have a hard time meeting their need.
Well, to me, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're extracting from the earth in a way that's harmful by itself, right? You can think about other times in history in which there was radical increases in population and production was close to not being able to provide for the needs, but nobody would say that you can make the inference from those facts to the fact that we're degrading the environment, right? You need additional kinds of facts to say that we're degrading the environment at that point, right?
Yeah. I agreed with you on all the waste stuff, like the healthcare waste. I wonder about that. I think that the stuff is getting, sold by people, and people are price gouging and stuff like that. And non-production can even equal profit, definitely. Like the WeWork thing you were talking about, I agree with that. And the dairy waste. So yeah, I agree with the fact that efficiency doesn't necessarily equal profit, and that even if you don't produce something, you can still make a profit. That's how corrupt capitalism is. So I agree with you on all that stuff. I also agree
more of what I was trying to say is that that most companies have an incentive to produce more than the population of people that they're selling to needs, and that there's an excess of things that they're producing that didn't need to be produced, and then that just it's a complete waste. It just goes to nothing, right?
Yeah.
It goes into the dirt, and then that usually there could be overproduction on that front, and that creates problems with depleting the environment at that point. But
so
let me just finish the small bit. If you can restructure the economy to, instead of have a motive for profit, but instead have a motive for providing for the needs of a population, you're going to reduce the amount that you produce, I think, by a
Absolutely.
radical amount, right? And
Yeah.
once you reduce that by that radical amount, we're going to get close to not depleting the earth anymore, right? There's going to need to be more positive steps after that to not to just stop like depleting the earth, right? Because we're going to need to probably take positive steps to change the earth back so that it could be in a better shape with regard to its longevity, right? But
Right.
at that point, the sentiment of the purpose of the economy and the social organization of the world will be past the point of things like profit and individual gain, and more to the point of a kind of mutual aid. You know what I mean? People will more recognize that things need to be done to make sure that even if we're not depleting the earth anymore, that positive steps need to be taken to enhance the earth, the environment in various ways, so that it goes to previous levels of like environmental health, if you want to call it that.
I'm hopeful that that happens. I think that would be really great. I don't know how realistic it is, though. I think, there's some promise that capitalism is having it seems to be its death throes right now. And I don't know. I'm wondering where you got this idea, though, that we have to choose between the population control or the consumption reduction. Because now that I've kind of talked to you about antinatalist policies being there without necessarily being called that when it comes to things like Planned Parenthood, and you say it's more empowering, and you kind of sugarcoat it a little bit. I say there's still a kernel of truth there, but I don't think you have to choose. I think we could do both.
I think, it would be okay if it does turn out to be the case that reducing the amount of population actually does have a positive aspect on the environment, which, by the way, I am skeptical of, because like I said, the economy and the way that production work is not responsive to changes in the population. It could be the case that you reduce the population and production still stays the same, because the economy is premised on growth, right? Even if the population is reducing, the economy is premised on growth, which means producing even more, right? You can you can decrease the population and not change production at all. And if
I think you're confusing it, that you're thinking that the population control measures have to have an effect on production, and I'm saying, can't they both happen separately at the same time?
Yeah, but if you're trying to, you can think about the policies, the antinatalist political policies, as not either, but you can have more of a bend of doing it to reduce the amount of harm that we're doing to the environment. That can be one bend that you tend to take, or you could kind of take the bend of, there's less truth in the fact that when you bring a person into the world, you have to be cognizant about the amount of harm that they're going to experience over the course of their life. And if it is the case that it's going to be more harm than good, then you should not bring that person into the world, right?
I see. You have an idea that we're in two camps. I don't have that concept at all.
Well, if you want to be the bend about considering the amount of harm a person that you're going to bring into the world, that's fine, right? I think those arguments are definitely plausible, and I think they're actually more than plausible. They're probably, some of them are probably sound, but what I'm skeptical of is it actually going to have a positive environmental act? Who knows, right? Because again, production is just not organized in a way to be responsive to the needs of a population. It just keeps growing, even if you try to reduce the amount of population. So it might be the case that as an antinatalist who wants to evaluate if a life is worth bringing into the world, using the environment as only part of the whole kind of population, right? Then you might still want to do those policies, but as a way of reducing environmental harm, it's just I'm skeptical if that actually even does anything.
So you don't believe the statistic that that the emissions or the carbon footprint of someone with one child is way huger than, say, two people without a child?
Well, you know how they do that, right? What they do is they don't actually trace what individual people do and what individual people put into the environment or how much they consume. They take the amount of production and they just divide it by the amount of people in the population.
I did not know that. Are you sure about that?
That's mainly the model. There's constantly efforts to try to actually measure the amount that people consume, but it's very expensive to do so. And if you look at, I mean, this is actually just a problem with social science in general. They don't usually like go to individual people and try to aggregate individual people data into larger data. They take mass level data that happens at a mass level, usually production, government kind of things, right? And then they infer to things about individual people.
Huh. Well, that's kind of how the law of big numbers works. That the more people you input into, the more variables you input into, then the more accurate number you're going to get out.
Yeah, but that's not exactly, think about it like this, right? What you were trying to say is that there's a difference between the numbers of the carbon footprint of people who have one child versus two children, right? But it's the
No,
way
I was
that,
saying one child versus no children.
oh, yeah, one child, whatever you want to say, right?
Yeah.
But if the way that the model is being produced is not actually looking at how individual people consume, right? And instead taking how much production that there is and then just roughly dividing it among the existing amount of people, it may be the case that people consume less than is produced, right?
I don't know enough about statistics. I don't know if you know enough about statistics.
Well, this is not about statistics. This is just about how an economic model is constructed, right?
Oh, okay.
We want to ask a question about, okay, what's the carbon footprint of an individual person? We could do that by starting with the people and observing a lot of different people's behavior and then aggregating that data. Or we can take the amount of things that are being produced and then have rough assumptions about the fact that people don't have lots of differences between how they consume between one another and then just divide it among all the people. That's what they tend to do. They tend to make assumptions about how people consume, right? Well, not really how people consume, because that would be question begging. They tend to make assumptions about the differences between how people consume based on various aspects of their political agendas and stuff like that, class agenda, various kinds of things. And then they divide the amount based on that, and then they control for differences between people, right? They don't actually usually look at individual people's consumption behaviors and then aggregate from there, because that's actually extremely costly to do, right? That's why surveys are usually most the way people, like individual people, get like polled, is because you can just send a thing to them and it doesn't cost that much as compared to going into a person's life and actually like documenting the individual things that they do for like a month or something like that.
I think the lesson there is that no one is the average, though. I mean, there's always a caveat when you look at things like, you know, carbon footprints, but they're comparing like to like. So I think what they're doing is, you know, just adding on another person of average emissions. And sure, no one's the average, but it gives you some idea of an increase in emissions.
It will be more probably, but I don't think that there's been a systematic effort to actually look at individual people's behaviors versus how many people that let's say households' behaviors of consumption. And if different amounts of people in the household change the amount of consumption that they do. Rather, what they do is they say, well, there are differences between this household and this household. It's probably going to be the case that because there's two people instead of one person, that there's going to be double the amount of production. And if we can control for their ideology, so for example, if you have a household that's like Republican red meat eaters or whatever versus like, you know, hippies or whatever that consume like, polenta or whatever, right? Then they'll control for those kind of small differences, right? But most of what they do is like literally just assuming various kinds of behavior based on like what people would consider common sense. Again, like I said, people are really trying to work on figuring out a bottom-up method where they try to look at individual households' actual consumption behaviors and try to measure it that way. But it's extremely expensive to do. Like it really is. It's extremely expensive to do. You have to have a way to, like, I mean, think about it like this. How would you try to, like, monitor the consumption of a household over the course of a month? It would just take a lot of resources to do that. You know what I mean? And if you want to do it for a lot of different people, it's just going to start to cost a lot of money. So instead of what they do is they take production at the production level and then just divide it through the population given certain kind of assumptions. And this is just like, this is what I get from, like, Angus Deaton's work. Maybe other people are, like, radically different, but I'm pretty sure Angus Deaton is like the person to look at, because I think he even won, like, a Nobel Prize or something like that. Like he's doing it the same way that everybody else is. You know what I mean?
Is he a labor person or labor economist or what?
I don't think he does labor economy specifically. I think he's just known for working on, like, the second and third world economies mostly.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. So
yeah, I agree with you on all that waste stuff. I just think that we can do the population control thing at the same time. I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I think they can be done simultaneously.
Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive either. I just question, as a way to reduce negative impact on the environment, if it actually even does anything. Like, I really don't know, because, like I said, production is not organized around being sensitive to the needs of the population that it is marketing to.
Well,
because production is still, like, organized around growth and profit, right? It could be the case, and in fact, I'd imagine we're going to get more information in the United States and other countries where the population increase is decreasing to the point where there's going to be literal non-increases year to year of the population at some point in the probably pretty close future in the United States and other countries, right? We're going to probably find out that there are going to be, like, slower decreases of people, that it flattens out, but that production is still going up, because that's just how production works. You know what I mean?
Well, no, but you keep saying that, but I'm saying we would be doing the measure to bring it down at the same time.
Well,
you have the population control and the production being brought down, because we're in the throes of capitalism now.
Definitely.
It's the time to do it.
Definitely, but I don't know what the point of the population control would be if it actually doesn't change. It doesn't change production by itself, and it doesn't change the amount of environmental harm that happens by itself. You know what I mean? Because of the way that production is organized.
What good it would do?
Well, I see what good it would do as, like, the antinatalist,
yes,
angle from reducing the amount of harm in the world.
Yes,
right?
There you go.
But that has to do, I think, less with reducing the amount of, like, resource depletion that's happening or something like that, or the amount of, like, atmospheric degradation that's happening. That has more to do with just reducing the amount of harm in the world. You can reduce the amount of harm in the world without really changing that much about the environment. That's definitely possible.
I think you see them as being invalid unless they're connected and mutually beneficial. And they don't have to be connected and mutually beneficial. We can have these are separate departments of, if you will, or separate branches of a system. So you have the antinatalist programs on population control separate from the programs that would reduce production down to a reasonable amount, and they work together at the same time. They happen, but they're functioning for different purposes. You seem to think they have to benefit one another, or there has to be some mutual benefit. And I'm just saying, you can do the antinatalist thing based alone on the fact that it's bringing less harm into the world. What more reason do you need?
Definitely. I mean, you don't need more reason, but it did seem to be that the people in that previous group were trying to say population control as a measure to actually reduce the environmental degradation.
Oh, No, but this is an antinatalist chat about the value of
Oh,
population control.
I'm okay with that. Yeah, that's whatever. Like that's like, but you have to admit, like that's what they were saying in that group. They were saying that they're trying to reduce the population to like make the environment better.
I would agree with that.
That's bad. Like it doesn't do that. It doesn't do that. And then at the same time, it usually incurs more harm if you don't do it in a way that affirms people's autonomy, right? You have to
Yeah,
do
we already
antinatalism.
smashed that though. We smashed that part of it.
So,
The
but that's why I was so against what they're saying. Like they're literally talking about like Malthusian economists. Like they're talking like literal Malthusians who want to just reduce the population without really any eye for what other consequences it's happening, with this ideology that it's going to magically make the environment better when it's not. It's about production, and
I don't
production is the
think they were
thing.
saying it was going to magically make the environment better. I think they were saying that it was, especially the natural progressive, was concerned about the harm of bringing people onto a melting planet, for sure. That was, something she kept reiterating.
Well,
So
but she thought that if you reduce the amount of people that you bring into the earth, like it stops melting or something. It like decreases the
no,
amount of.
I didn't get that impression. It was more of like,
I
let's not
definitely
bring
did.
people onto a melting planet. So we agreed that we could do those two things together.
Well, but at that point, that's just pure defeatism. You're not even trying to aim to make the planet better. I guess that was really what they were trying to say. They said they had the whatever, what was it called? The we're fucktism or whatever thing. I thought that was just like an attitude and not like an actual prescriptive mode where they're saying we need to make the environment better, right? It's one thing to reduce the amount of harm in the world. You can reduce the amount of harm in the world by letting the planet go to shit and just reducing the amount of people and letting us go extinct. That's going to reduce the amount of harm in the world, because even if the planet goes to shit, there's just going to be none of us here, right? But I want to do that. I want to make a world where it makes sense to bring people in because they're going to be good lives. You know what I mean? That seems to be a much better approach to have to me. You also,
Lollipops and rainbows for you.
well, seriously, why does that sound bad?
It doesn't sound bad. It sounds unrealistic. It doesn't sound like it's not going to
Well,
work.
well, I think the throes of irrealism are always used as ideological measures to make sure that things don't get better. It doesn't
Maybe.
necessarily it doesn't necessarily come from a place of individual people thinking, like intending that when they say those kinds of things, right? But when you stop thinking that it's possible for the world to be better, then it kind of just does in certain ways. You know what I mean? I
Well,
am
I mean,
trying to
to
make the
think that
world a
it's
better
been
place.
getting better, to think that it's been getting better is kind of, look at us. We're facing a pandemic right now. It's kind of like, how great is life now? We have all these comforts of capitalism, but we're all locked up and isolated from each other. We can't go out, you know?
Well, did I say it was getting better?
No, but how is it going to get better in our children's lifetime if it hasn't gotten better
Well,
yet?
I think it starts with large anti-capitalist reform. It starts with people making sure that labor makes sense. It starts with making sure that
So make our
production,
kids do all the political work.
I guess, but it doesn't matter who does it. What matters is that it happens, right?
Well, you're kind of putting that onus onto the children you're bringing into the world. That's a pretty big load to put on the up and comers, isn't it? Save the planet.
I guess it could be, right? If you want to think that it's not worth it to even make an attempt to try to make a better world.
I don't think
And
it's worth the burden and the harm that it does.
okay, that's fine. That's fine, right? I am unsure about what that calculation is. I could see it going either way at this point in history, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like it seems like there are sects of antinatalists. I don't know where you fall because I don't know what you believe or whatever, but it seems like there are sects of antinatalists that are just not even interested in trying to see if the calculation will ever come out as positive ever. You know what I mean? They just think it's always going to come out as negative, so you got to start going down, baby. You know what I mean? I want to see if the calculation will come out as positive. I want to start making a world that's the calculation is going to start coming out as positive. If that means, things like bringing people into the world where their lives are going to be worse, it may be the case that we shouldn't make an attempt. But I don't think anybody is even is trying to figure out if that's the case or not. You know what I mean? I think that there are these kind of platitudes about the harm of the world and stuff like that. For example, what was that ideology that started with E, F-aliens or whatever it is? That shit about DNA, the DNA trap. What the fuck is that? That makes no sense. It makes no sense. It's literally just ideology. It is pure ideology. It's just a new way of edgy internet atheists to recreate their misreading of Nietzsche and use vaguely scientific language in the process. This happens like literally every 3 years on the internet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if that's the kind of direction that antinatalists want to go, like, I don't want to even try to see if the calculation is going to come out as positive, right? Then
well, think about the calculation, though. The calculation is all of man's existence, the suffering of all of man's existence versus the next generation. How likely is it that the next generation is going to have so much joy and positivity that it's going to outweigh the length of human existence suffering?
I don't know.
You can say you don't know.
I don't know.
You can really say that with a straight face after your reality-based and time-tested, very rational arguments on population control that it doesn't work and yada yada, but you can't say for sure based on all these years of human suffering that there's not going to be more in the future?
There's going to be more suffering in the future. Is there going to be a net increase? I don't know.
But is the next generation going to be able to outweigh from the beginning of man until now all of that suffering?
Well, probably not. Of course
Well,
not.
that's the net calculation, Mando.
Well, that seems like a bad calculation to make, right? You're trying to put.
But it's the argument that natalists have been making. Every generation of natalists has been making this argument that things are going to get better.
Well,
that's why they continue to have kids, is because they believe it's going to get better.
Well, I don't, that's not, I think people should have kids for different kinds of reasons that things are going to get better. I think the decision to have kids is not about a world's getting better. It's much more a local decision than that, right? But if that's really what the argument is, right, that bringing another generation in is, if they don't offset the amount of suffering that has happened through all of human history hit here too, that is not a good argument to me, right? That's not a good argument to me, because like what at that point, like, it doesn't even seem like you think about it like this, right? The amount of suffering in human history here too has been, let's say, imaginable, right? Let's say it's literally been imaginable, right? And then let's say it's that the next generation is going to have a net good life, but only mildly net good life. Obviously, that's not going to outweigh the imaginable amount of suffering in the world. But at that point, it seems like you actually don't even care about the net good of a generation. A generation is going to come in and have a net good life. It seems like.
Not only does that not convince me, but even if their generation has kids that have an even better life, it's going to have to go so many generations to catch up, because they're still going to be suffering. So
yeah.
It's going to add on more.
Here's something that happens in general kinds of problems with consequentialism in general, right? Individual people are the beings that are the locus of suffering, right? You can't say, for example, if I put your suffering and my suffering together, that there is a new unit of person, such as this total sum of our suffering, and then there's also your suffering, and then there's my suffering. It's still just your suffering and my suffering, right? So when you say all of the suffering hit here too, and through the through the history of you know the of all of human history, right? That's not an entity. There are individual people who suffered, right? Their lives are done, right? Their lives are done. It was wrong to let them suffer. We should have organized a world in which it wouldn't be that they would suffer, right? But what's the need to out what's the need to compensate for that at that point, right? Why do we need to compensate, especially if you have a generation that's
Because
going
it's
to have a
still
net
going
good
up.
life?
Because it's still going up.
Yes, but what if you had a generation that had a net good life? What happens at that point?
It's not going to offset all these that came before.
But why does it need to offset it?
Because otherwise it's a simple calculation. It's not worth bringing them into a world where they are going to still suffer and they're not going to offset the suffering. I mean, it's very easy to calculate.
I'm saying it's a net. If you
I understand the net good, the net joy or net pleasure, if you will.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that it's just a very, I don't know how to explain it. To me, it's a very simple calculation that if the next generation isn't going to erase all of what came before, then what's the point?
Well, the point is that if they have a net good life, then for them, their life was good. And that's for looking at individual. You're right. I don't know if that's going to happen. That's why we need to look at individual people. We're not looking at trying to compensate for the whole of history. We're looking at individual cases. Is this being that we bring into the world going to experience more harm or a net pleasure? Is that being going to do it? It's not going to be, are these beings together going to outweigh all of the suffering that has happened hit here too?
Here's what
right?
I have to say to that is that humans are incapable of doing that.
Doing what?
Having a net good existence, creating a world where a person can have a net good existence. I don't think that's a possibility.
Okay, that's interesting. I don't think that's the case. I definitely think there are some people who have had a net good life, and from their perspective, they even think they had a net good life. And they're not the kind of people that are like deluded or anything like that either. Because I know there probably is an amazing amount of people that are deluded into thinking that they have a net good life or something like that, right? Let's even put that on the table. I think that there are definitely people who are not deluded into thinking that they have a good life and in fact have had a net good life. And I don't think it's a meager number either. I don't know if it's more, if it's like even close to the amount of people that have had net bad lives, but it's not a meager number.
So do you know that 1 out of 7 people in the world still shits in the open? That's
yeah, I do. I do know that.
That's a statistic that really brings it down to earth for me, because you're talking about people having a net good life, and that's like a diamond. That's more rare than a unicorn, to me. So maybe it's just a difference of perception. I don't even know how we came to a disagreement, because we were agreeing on everything else. It seems like you still don't think we can do population control at the same time as lower production.
Well, you can, but the point of the population control isn't going to be to try to make the environment better. The point is going to be to prevent harm, right?
Okay, that's where we agree.
The people that were in that previous chat it really did seem like they were trying to say, let's reduce the population to make the environment better. I don't think that's a good policy. Reducing the amount of people doesn't make the environment better by itself.
Well, one less child is one less car on the road. All those cars add up. That's a lot of emissions. People don't carpool like they're supposed to. People don't take the bus like they're supposed to. Because humans There
Yeah.
are a few good humans. There are a few good humans that put things in place like bus systems and carpooling. And humans are too stupid to use that stuff and too selfish to use that stuff. So, you know,
Well, here's a question. If we got rid of all of the cars today, what difference would it make?
a huge difference.
No, it would not make a huge difference. You know why? Because
Why?
they're still going to be making cars. They're still going to be making cars, right? It's about production, right? I don't know the exact estimates, but from what I can remember, my general impression from what I can remember is that individual contribution to pollution, right, from literal individual people in the capacity as individual people and not in the capacity as businesses, right, or as enterprises, make up somewhere in the region of like 20 to like 35 or 40% of all all environmental depletion. That's not a
That's huge.
paltry number. You're right. But if you think about it like this, it also changes depending on where you are too. Most of it happens in the United States, Canada, Germany, France, Sweden, those countries. If you look at, for example, Haiti, the amount of pollution that the average Haitian puts into the world is literally almost nothing. In some
And they're the
cases,
ones with the high rates of increase in population.
yeah, so they can be increasing the population and they're not increasing the amount of pollution. We are the people.
Yeah.
We're the people that are polluting. They're not polluting, right? The way that pollution happens in the second and third world is through production for the most part, especially inefficient production due to the fact of insufficient capital. So, for example, there's a baseball factory in Haiti that they used to make all the MLB baseballs in, and they stopped making it there because it just wasn't as efficient of a factory for the MLB anymore. They found a factory that made the same amount of balls for them for a lower price in Malaysia, so now they're all made in Malaysia, right? So in that case, it was just about the efficiency of price at that point. But the reason why they switched was because Haiti didn't have as efficient of a factory, because they don't have sufficient amount of capital to increase their amount of production to consumption ratio of actual output, right? So for the most part, the pollution that comes from non-quote unquote first world countries, I don't like using the first to third world thing because there's problems with that, but most of it happens through production, and almost none of it happens from individual people, and yet those are where the population is increasing the most. So if you're trying to say, okay, we're going to reduce the population to make the environment better and not to just decrease harm overall, right? But those are not even the people that are polluting the most, then what you're doing is you're just reducing the population of people for the end of like making the environment better when it doesn't actually do that. And if you add on to the fact that governments tend to do it in a very bad way, right? They're not doing it mostly through, giving people education. It's not like the IMF is the head of making sure everything's okay or whatever, right? They're happening through other methods historically that have been awful, right? Then at that point, what's happening? This doesn't make any sense anymore, right? The reason you want to do it is to reduce the amount of harm if you want to go the anti-natalist route, right? It's not because if you reduce the amount of population, then
I'm still going to argue with you on that point because I think you have a blind spot. Okay, I think that emissions are not just individual emissions, like how much I drive my car. I think that it's also in what I consume. And yes, there is some waste, but I think you might be under representing what a person emits via consumption and over representing what production is that's overproduced. Although I agree with you because I am an anti-capitalist and I'd like us to end this capitalist disaster. So tell me where I'm wrong here.
Well, I don't want to tell you where you're wrong, but I want to just give you a couple figures to maybe make you reconsider that position, right? Did you know that there was about a 5-year span from the 70s to the 80s with that there were more cars that were on the lot, right? Like just on the lot in random places throughout the United States than were being driven. There were, right? That seems to be incredibly wasteful to me. That makes zero sense, but it was profitable for them at the time, so that's why they did it, right? Tesla also does this too. Tesla has an immense amount of cars that they're just not using right now, and they're not going to sell. Even if they stopped making cars right now, they wouldn't sell their whole stock within even 50 years. And they're
Yeah,
still
but those cars aren't emitting anything because they're not being used. Yes, there was
yes,
and consumption in producing them, but the people that have bought the cars are you that adds to their
it definitely does. It definitely
all the
does.
food that they buy that they waste adds to their waste profile.
It definitely does. But for the average person, right? It's for the average person, it seems like, think about the amount of pollution and negative environmental externalities that was caused by producing one car that will never be used, right? How much does that compare to the amount of pollution and negative environmental externalities one individual is going to cause through their individual consumption qua person and not qua business alone, right? Is it going to be double? Is it triple? Is it quadruple? From what I've seen, it's not even double.
Oh, huh.
And that's what it goes back to, how the ratio between individual pollution versus pollution qua businesses. From what I've seen, it's about like 25 to like maybe the high estimates I've seen are 40% is individual consumption pollution versus the rest of it being business pollution.
Yeah, but you're still not factoring in that business pollution, a large part of it is driven by demand. So it's getting consumed by the consumers, and that's raising their number.
Yeah, if you want to say large in terms of like a non-ignorable number, yes. Majority, I don't even know. I think there are literally some industries that make more than double that the amount that that people individually consume, because there are ways to still make money from it. Here's an example, right? Think about like Boeing or Lockheed Martin or any company that makes mass amounts of vehicles, right? Oh, here's actually a great thing. So I'm gonna switch tracks here. Public transportation production, right? Somebody has to produce cable cars, somebody has to produce trains, somebody has to produce buses, et cetera, right?
Yes.
The public transportation industry of producing public transit vehicles has been really bad, because basically, politically speaking, they do things like replace like trains every like 20 years to say, oh, we're doing this all again, we're doing it all again, right? But because it serves the political end of making it seem like, you know, certain political regimes are increasing public transit and stuff like that, right? So there's estimates that in the United States that there are something between like triple or something less than quadruple, but something more than triple the amount of like unused mass transit vehicles that are just sitting somewhere right now. Those are just, that means that the industry of making mass transit vehicles has made triple the amount that was even needed by the population at all, right?
Yeah.
If instead they made a third of that, right, it would still be okay if the vehicles that were being consumed actually and being used were still polluting. It would reduce it by like a factor of like double or 1.5, because if we have to think about that third that actually goes and gets used and stuff like that, let's say that it adds the same amount that it was, let's say it adds the same amount that's at parity for how much it cost or how much pollution it was emitted just to make the vehicle in the first place, right? So just by reducing it, you reduce it by a factor of somewhere between 1.5 to like 2.5 or 3, right? So even though it is not a paltry number for what individuals put in terms of pollution and other negative environmental externalities, right? Focusing on that in any way, in a robust way, and putting resources in terms of political and social capital resources towards that does not seem to be the way to go for me. It seems to be the way to go is definitely go towards production, pollution, and other environmental negative externalities, right? And because of that, the way you're going to have to do that is through changing the way that the economy works, instead of things being for profit and for individual gain and for increasing of capital. It's going to be more for the needs of the population, and those kind of sentiments are going to make populations of people realize, I think, hopefully, and I there's still a lot of work to be done on this. I'm hopeful about it, but I could admit maybe I'm wrong to be hopeful about it, that when people see a change in the economy towards towards production being geared towards the needs of people rather than profit, then individuals will see the role that they play in a cooperative venture of the world, right? And maybe are going to be more apt to reduce their personal negative.
We can't even get people to wear masks.
Yeah, but there hasn't been like a fair amount. I don't think even the average. The masks, I think, is a weird thing. It had to happen like literally like 2 or 3 months, right? This is something that's going to happen over the course of years.
Stupid though, Mando.
I mean,
all your ideas are really great and everything. I just don't know how realistic it is in the next generation. And what do you think about the people that don't have a net good coming into the world?
Well, that's wrong.
But you don't want to do anything about it.
Well, no. What you should do is like not bring them in, or radically change the world. Or radically change the world such that it changes very quickly or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. It needs a radical change. I agree.
But I think
revolution.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that. But the thing that I'm scared of is the way that those people in that chat we're talking about is that woman literally said at some point, "I don't care about individual rights. We just need to make the environment better." What the fuck is that? That's literally fascism. That's eco-fascism, right? Did you hear her? You heard her say that, right?
Which one said that?
I think it was, I don't know who these people are. It was the main lady who was running the whole chat. I think her name's Christine. She literally said, "I don't care about personal rights or anything like that. We need to make the environment better." Like, what? Like, that's literally eco-fascism at that point, right? You can change. It's one thing to the reason why what we're saying is very different from that is because nobody thinks that businesses have the right to extract profit and like make negative externalities. So if we stop that, like, that's not a violation of rights. Like, everybody, like, those people are still going to be exceedingly fine, right? Nothing is going to change about their lives such that they're going to be worse off in any robust way possible, right? But if you start not caring about people's rights that have genuine rights as individual people, right? Then you start getting things like the China one-child policy, where you infringe on people's ability to use their body how they see fit and their ability to operate as an autonomous individual in hopes of trying to make the environment better, which is obviously misguided to me, right? And extremely harmful, likely. And to claim, I have no clue how she thinks about that from a antinatalist perspective, because at that point, like, what, like, that's not, like, that doesn't make less harm in the world. Like, that doesn't, like, it just doesn't, right? You've just reduced the amount of people and you've made the harm like the same. So now probably the average person maybe even experiences more harm, which in some sense is worse, because you could have the same amount of harm, like overall suffering, but if now it's concentrated in less people, like, that sounds like an even worse position, you know?
I don't know. I go back and forth because I feel like people are really dumb and need to be uh, dominated in some ways. I mean, I do have an authoritarian bent to my personality, and it seems like people are so dumb that they can't make their own decisions. So I think I'm more in line with taxing people heavily for having children, because we give the benefits of, like, you know, school levies. Everybody has to pay for those. I had to pay for those when I was a homeowner, and I don't think that's fair because I didn't have any kids using the school system. So rather than taking money from taxpayers, people who have children should be paying high taxes because their kids are going to need a lot of services. And then, you know.
So I understand that kind of perspective, but wouldn't the better way just to be more like an anarchist, right? Destroy most institutions, instead replace them with voluntary associations, right? That seems to be a much better route than instead creating even more, for example, tax structures that have nothing to do with the will of individual people, or, you know, stuff like that, right? That stuff, like, to
Feeding the beast. You feel like it's just feeding the beast to make another tax law.
yeah, or something like that. That's another thing I don't understand. Like, how can you be an antinatalist and think that a solution to world suffering is to, like, increase the power of the government? What? Like, no, that's a terrible idea. Governments are huge parts of why people, you know, induce suffering. You know what I mean? Like, so when that woman said, like, I don't care about rights and people should be heavily taxed and stuff like that for having kids, like that's just seems so wrong-headed to me. Like, you're making one of the biggest factors of why people, you know, experience net suffering even more powerful. Instead, you should be advocating for abolishing most institutions and replacing them with voluntary associations of people based on need. You know what I mean? That's why I tend to be a little bit more anarchistic than statist about certain things. Although I'm still open to various kinds of statism in certain ways, I'm not exactly personally confident in my anti-statism yet. But at least it sounds way more plausible than, like, making a bigger state for the ends of taxing people because it's going to reduce suffering. No, that doesn't seem to work at all. Like why would an antinatalist team up with the government to make suffering less? No, that just doesn't seem to work at all. You team up with individual people and you try to go for the government. You know what I mean?
Well, I think it's the difference between generations, because I'm in between your generation and their generation. So I would say that there's a real reality-based argument that they're making, that you have to deal with the legislative body. You can't get away from that. And if you're going to be political, you have to deal with laws.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
so, you know, taxes are part of laws. So,
Well, I tend to think that making more taxes is not a good way to go. If you want a political praxis at that point, here's what you should do: more labor unions, more, for example, bullying or using the tools of, for example, cancel culture to expose your local city councilman and extort them into making better laws. You know what I mean? That seems to be a much better way of doing things than instead letting Congress make another law to tax the rest of us. You know what I mean?
so then what's the antinatalist version of that?
I think they should be.
Council person.
Well, I think that the antinatalist should be on my side, right? Like, if you have a choice as an antinatalist for your praxis about how to reduce suffering, should you go for making it really tough for people to have children, such that when they do, that they're going to incur more harm as individuals, which is going to go on those children? Or do you go the direction of making better labor conditions for people, making sure that housing is a thing that makes sense for people, extorting your local politician to make better laws, right? I think that direction sounds much more promising than punishing people for having like
I'm on
children.
board with you. I'm on board with you. I just don't see an option for antinatalism in that regard.
Well, here's why I think that my solution tends to be better, right? Either way, you're not going, well, if you do the tax direction, you will literally probably be reducing the amount of people that will come into the world at a future time. But you do that by penalizing existing people and people who are going to come in the world during that process, right? And so what you're basically doing is taking out like a sort of harm loan, if you want to say. The people who would have existed and who would have had a bad life, their harm, now that they don't exist, is just going to go on the people that are currently existing and more soon coming into the world, right? Through increased taxation and punishment and stuff like that, right?
Okay,
I don't want to.
what's the other side?
My side is trying to make a better world, right? And making a better world is going to make it such that the people who come into the world are going to be less likely, even if marginally so, to have a bad life. Would you rather take out a harm loan of sorts, or would you rather make every new life better?
You're not going to make every new life better. Where are you?
Marginally. Think about it like this. If we live in a world in which labor conditions make sense, housing is a right, and taxes only matter to a degree that, or let's say that, I don't want to say taxes, let's say that burdens that happen to people in the course of a public political environment or public political culture only happen to create value. So there's also stuff about taxes where people think that most taxes don't create value. You can pay $1,000 for services, but it only creates you $800 worth of services, right? So if you get rid of most governmental institutions, instead make voluntary cooperatives and stuff like that, it's more likely that burdens that incur on individuals are going to come at value for them. So they might have to pay out $100 to be part of some sort of collective, but they're going to get $300 worth of value.
But
right?
Where does the antinatalism fit in? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Well, I don't know. The antinatalism just comes in while you're making the world better. You convince people to not have kids. Like, that's it. You just have to voluntarily convince people to not have kids. It doesn't make sense to me as an antinatalist to be the kind of person who uses force to make sure that people don't have kids. Using force to make sure people don't have kids is taking out a harm loan. Like I said, you're taking the harm of the people that you're not making exist and just putting it on the people that currently exist and are more imminently going to come into existence.
I can also see problems with implementing a tax burden where the people that would be paying for it would be resentful of it, and the people who couldn't afford it would be having kids anyway. My idea was that you could say that if someone can't afford to house and clothe and feed their child, then their child becomes a ward of the state. And
that could work if the ward of the state is actually going to
be a good place for them, be a secure place for them.
Yeah, and also think about it like this. A lot of the reason people have kids in non-first world countries is as ways to make their family unit better through labor, right? Through free labor and stuff like that, right? So if you make somebody the ward of the state, but that person was banking on that kid to take care of them when they can't work anymore, now that person is just going to go into wither away into harm forever until they die.
How would you feel sorry for someone who had kids just to take care of them in older years, though? I mean, that's
I know that it is a selfish move, right? But think about it like this, right? You have two options as an individual. Don't have kids, and when you get old, you're going to just wither, and it's going to be awful, right? Option two, have kids, and then raise them sufficiently enough, even if it's a net negative, such that they will take care of you and hope that the same happens for them. That is usually the choice that people are facing.
And so it's a cruel burden to put on children.
It is, but it's also a cruel burden to say you now don't have the option to have a child anymore. You're going to have to wither away as an adult. Sorry.
Well, there should never be the justification of having a child that the child will help the parent. So in opposite sense, there should be no argument that taking that child away from the parent is a harm to the parent, because that was never to be expected ethically in the first place.
Well, now you're getting into a normativized conception of harm, right? It is a fact that if you take the child away from that parent, the parent is going to have a worse elderly phase of their life than if they had the child. So even if they're not entitled,
the child will have a better life.
Well, that depends if the ward of the state is actually going to do things.
That does depend on if the ward
right.
of the state is good, exactly.
Right. But
so I would say that we're coming to like an antinatalist and collaborative community kind of like vision that I like. I mean, it almost is reminiscent of like the Black Panthers that had their community-based education for children, right? They taught and they homeschooled more or less. And to raise children that do exist in this way might present a new generation that would turn things around. But again, you're putting so much burden on those children, basically having to brainwash them for a cause.
Yeah.
It's not fair. You know, it doesn't.
That's definitely true, but it's the product of the fact that there are other larger economic problems that people are having to make a choice between one bad option that puts the harm on that puts, that brings a person into the world, and maybe even likely that person is going to have a net negative life, and then they have to hope that they're going to have to bring another person into their life because they're going to have to take care of them older, versus not having a child and withering away at your old age, or when you can't labor anymore, whatever comes first, right?
I don't worry about it too much on a personal note. I mean, I'm not going to have kids, and I don't worry about my care in my older years.
Well, I mean, that's your decision to make. That's okay, right? But I mean, there's a whole swath of people out there who are in like way worse conditions on that front, right? For example, I don't know about your life, so this is me just taking the very small amount of details that I know about you from very minimal live streams, right?
I hear you.
If, let's say at some point you have zero ability to labor, you can do nothing to labor, right? Is there no network for you to be able to get help at that point? Probably not, right? You might have family. If they're not around, there's definitely kinds of public aid that's going to be available for you, maybe through the form of some sort of governmental payments. There's going to be nonprofit organizations that maybe will put you into a large group home that even if it sucks, it's going to be bad. But if you go into the third world, there are none of those options. There are zero of those options. So to say that you as an individual don't worry about you getting older as you age, right? You have to realize that you're going to have forms of capital that are available to you that are just not available to people in the third world. Maybe not, though. Again, I don't know about your life. If you don't have those forms of capital available to you once you can't labor anymore, let me know. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, that just goes to show how we do need those collaboratives, though, and those community programs to help each other, because that's the need that's definitely there. But
I definitely think that's the case too. But you're not going to be able to create those kinds of institutions while the way that production works in the third world, where the way it works is just everybody is exploited, basically. You know what I mean? It's starved of capital in various kinds of ways and stuff like that. You can't make mutual aid organizations when there's no aid in the first place to give to each other.
Yeah, I think the best we can do in those places is just to educate the women that they can make control over their choices and
And I'm very okay with
hope
that.
for the best.
I think that's a good thing, even for non-antinatalist reasons, and also for antinatalist reasons.
Yeah. So it seems like your argument is kind of like you're able to, you could even, or maybe I'm off, but I think this makes a point that you could make the argument that because someone didn't ask to be born, they're justified in bringing someone else into this world uh, to take care of them because they didn't ask to be born.
Well, it depends on what you mean by justification. This is me getting overly technical here because I do philosophy, but there are various senses of justification, right? It is obviously justified as a prudent decision from that person. It is prudent for them to do it, right? It seems to be justified maybe given contemporary political culture and norms, right? It might, given the political world that we live in today, they are not going to be going against the rule of law or any associated form of the rule of law to do so, right? But at the other end, it's probably morally not justified because it's not right to bring in a life that is going to be a net bad just to offset various kinds of harms that you're going to experience in a later part of life. But here's the kicker with that kind of thing. Do you want morality to be the kind of thing that demands of people to experience harm in their life on a non-ignorable scale, right? To be moral, right? Do you want people to have to experience harm to be moral? It's unclear. These are one of the things that, like, it's just hard to do. And there's a lot of people still working on it, and I don't know if there's solutions to it. So it may be the case that it's morally wrong. It may not be the case that it's morally wrong. It depends on your attitude about what the demands of morality should be in light of what the demands of morality need to be given what people have to take on to be moral people.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we agree on most everything. We still debate on how much impact the antinatalism or population control can affect environmental conditions. Uh, I think that you probably think that I exaggerate one more than the other, and I think you underplay one more than the other. So it's like a
Yeah,
nuance.
yeah,
So I'm going to go through and see if I can upload this to YouTube. It's been
yeah.
an awesome discussion. I'm so happy to hear you talk, and I hope that the people that were in the chat that were frustrated by you not being able to be heard will find some satisfaction in this.
Yeah, hopefully. That was a good conversation with you too. It's very nice.
You're awesome, Mando. Thank you so much. Bye.
See ya.